for the same reason that we're always seeing threes when we study somebody like St. Augustine. Wow. Okay, let's just, if you were to go online, for example, and you were to look at, hey, what is Paradise Lost about? Some of you, I'm sure, are doing that very thing as you're studying this poem. What are they going to say this is a poem about? Well, just to prove to you that there's all different ways to talk about this poem. How about this one? I just picked this off of one of those myriads of sites online, where scholars say Paradise Lost is about hierarchy and order. We think immediately, of course, think of all the different kinds of hierarchies and the ways in which those hierarchies are either useful, beneficial, or not. Think about, for example, in the first and the second book of Paradise Lost, how the demons, the fallen angels, immediately kind of create a certain kind of hierarchy so that they can have a certain kind of order. Paradise Lost is about disobedience and revolt. Right? Is it good to fight against the power, or is it dangerous to go against the authority and the power? You'll remember that Satan, sounding kind of like an epic hero, says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Up yours, I won't do it. Of course, think of our dates, as we've already said. 1667. 100 years later would be 1767. Whoa, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the Declaration of Independence. So is it good or bad to fight against the system? Milton himself, of course, politically had to come to terms with that idea because he had not been a supporter of the king. And there were many who said that was a major, major bad move on his part. How about this one? Paradise Lost is about sin and innocence, or as Blake will say it, songs of innocence, songs of experience. Which is better? To live with ignorance or to have knowledge? When were Adam and Eve most like God? This is a tough question, right? We raised this question earlier. Remember, that verse from Genesis 3 even, now man has become as us, knowing good and evil. Wow. Was man and woman more like God before they quote-unquote fell or sinned, or after? Which is a better place to be? Do you feel like you are better off before you've known anything about Paradise Lost, or now that you know something about Paradise Lost? Which is better? How about this one? Paradise Lost is a poem about free will and predestinationism, determinism, or fate. Which is it? And how do those work together? And of course, the blame game starts to be picked up in this one as well. Who is to blame? Of course, for the fact that you are here at all. Remember what Adam even says in one of his soliloquies. I did not ask to be born. Now I'm born. This is not fair. This is not just. This is not right. Oh, wait. I shouldn't think that way. Doesn't matter. Speaking of Adam, how about this one? This is a poem, finally, of love. It's a poem about marriage. From our sociological perspective, it's a poem about what it means when two people decide to try to cohabitate, and then bad stuff starts happening. Well, how about our approach? We said, now in conclusion, we said that we would study Paradise Lost from three perspectives. So let's review now. We said we would study Paradise Lost as an epic. Okay, we've studied epics. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Dante's Divine Comedy, especially Inferno. So, in all of those we understand, you got to have an epic hero. Question, who do you think of as the epic hero? Lots of answers, right? Immediately it could be seen as Satan. Some people see it, of course, as Adam. Some people see it as Eve. Some people see it as the Son or God. It's him, God, the character God in the poem. Epics all have journeys. Do we have journeys in this poem? And if so, what kind of journeys? Well, we have a lot of journeys, don't we, right? I mean, we have a lot of different types of traveling that occurs. You could even make the argument that Michael takes Adam on a journey into the future. And of course, as we pointed out, the last word of the poem is way, journey. Okay, we got to have epic battle, epic war. We know that we're going to have epic battles, epic wars. What kind of epic battles? Well, it's almost like a mock battle. Nobody dies in that battle, in that famous battle, of course, in books 5 and 6 of Satan getting thrown out of hell. And in fact, he doesn't get thrown out of hell, does he? He jumps because he does not want to live in hell, in heaven, with defeated with the Father, the Son, and of course the Archangel Michael, the Jackson, right? So we got wars. But wait, we got other kinds of battles. We got other kinds of wars, don't we? We have the war of the mind. That's our psychological understanding. We have the war of the group, right? Adam against Eve, etc., etc. Now, we also say that an epic is like a national song or national anthem. It tells us something. If you want to know about Greek culture, read the Iliad or the Odyssey. If you want to know about Roman culture, take a look at Virgil's Aeneid. Interesting. What is it that we learn in our reading of Paradise Lost about our culture? Many of us will say that the patriarchal view, the misogynist opinions and attitudes of Milton are explainable because of the time when he himself is living. He was considered actually somewhat liberal in his views regarding women. He wrote tracts on divorce. He himself was married 3 times, and yet he is a product of his culture, no question. Number 2, we said Paradise Lost was a text of philosophy and theology. Of course, we talked already about these major talking points. Let's go over them again. Epistemology, what you know. Of course, you can have an absolutist position. I am right and everybody else is wrong. Or you can have the immediate opposite of that, the relativist position. There are no rights. There are no wrongs. There is no absolute. Of course, that, it starts to sound like an absolute, and the performative contradiction seems to contradict the relativist position, which is why some people struggle. Okay, well then what do I do? Just go back to the absolutist position? We talked about the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong about that. How about this one? When is knowledge bad? When is it dangerous? When is it necessary to go beyond the bounds of knowledge as one knows it? And we think, don't we, of that Tennyson line in Ulysses, to go beyond the bounds of utmost thought, right? As the old man is talking about the very end of his life. Of course, philosophically, if we're going to talk about epistemology, we've got to talk as well about ontology. These are, of course, terms that we should, I hope, be fluent with after all of these lectures that I've given. But ontology, that study of being. Is it true you are what you know? Physically, does Eve change after she gains the knowledge of the forbidden fruit? She even says it. What shape will I come to Adam in? She is aware that if you know things, you somehow fundamentally are a different kind of person. And yet, notice by the end of the poem, she's back to, I will never leave your side, I will always stay with you, Adam. Which obviously begs the question, how it all unfolded afterwards. The Bible doesn't say much about it, other than to say that they have a couple and then ultimately 3 sons. Doesn't talk anymore at all about the relationship between Adam and Eve. The ontological question, and I'm thoroughly convinced, sometimes students will say, dude, I don't believe in all this God stuff, and I don't believe in religion, so I shouldn't be reading a poem like this. And I completely disagree with that. For example, how about this question? What about the idea that this poem suggests that you are somehow special? Aristotle made that argument in regards to poetics, the idea that you and your dog can both look at a sunset, but only you, as a human, can appreciate the sunset. Are you special? And if you are special, in what ways are you special? This poem argues that you are special because you have special kinds of things given to you. The capacity to reason, to overcome, for example, other kinds of emotions and desires. Does that make you special and somehow therefore different? How about this one philosophically, theologically? The theodicy question. We put it on the board at the very beginning with that triangle, didn't we? A mother who is watching her child die of cancer. Oh, I wish there was a God powerful enough to cure my daughter's cancer. There is. That must be a mean God. No, all-loving deity. Are you kidding me? There is such a thing as an all-powerful, all-loving deity, and yet my daughter is dying of cancer? Explain that to me. That's the theodicy question, and of course, that's Milton's project. The answer, of course, is very, very simple, right? The theodicy question is answered by simply, God creates humans with the ability to choose. Free choice, or agency as it's sometimes referenced. Of course, the term free will doesn't appear in the Bible even once. Some have argued the concept might appear there, but the term doesn't. Milton makes this term part of the language of English for the rest of history. And of course, here we are engaging in it now. Is it a legitimate argument? Does it work for you, for example? How about this one? The theodicy idea is always going to lead to the blame game. Who do you blame for all the bad stuff? What does Paradise Lost seem to suggest, the poem, about this? Eve? Does Eve in the end get the lion's share of the blame? Is it Adam? Is it some combination of the two? How about this? Is it the serpent or Satan? Or do we lay the blame at, for example, the Creator God or the Son? Maybe by extension, Michael. Where was Michael with his major's flaming sword and all of that? Where was Michael, for example, guarding Eden? Finally, we said that Paradise Lost is a text of politics, from the psychological as well as from the sociological. Let's just play that game out really quickly. How about character analysis? From the psychological side, Freud said, of course, that we have to always pay attention to motives, not just to behavior, but to motives, what lies behind the behaviors. What are the motivations for behavior of? And then let's just play the game right out. Now, Satan, what are his motivations? What are the motivations for Adam to do what Adam does? What are the motivations for Eve as she decides to eat from the forbidden fruit? What are the motivations for God the Father and, of course, the Son? The Son says, I will take care of it. I will go down. I will be the propitiation. I will be the sacrifice. I can solve this problem. What are the motivations for all these different characters? From a sociological perspective, how about this one? Notice how there is a beautiful case study of what it's like to put a bunch of demons together, and then we start watching who takes precedence. Notice how Satan is brilliant with his questions. He's brilliant with his motivational rhetoric. We think immediately of Plato's comments in Republic, as we said earlier, about how Plato said the greatest politicians of our time are these ones who can talk. They're demagogues. They can talk, and everybody just kind of blindly follows along. We've pointed out before, of course, in other lectures, that this seems to be the history of the world. Speakers come out, and they're able to talk and lead people and move people. Of course, think about sociology from the perspective of Adam and Eve. Is it the case that two best pals or friends or lovers, everything's going great, everything does go great, but what happens, for example, when something gets jacked up and then all of a sudden you got this tension that starts to happen? Adam and Eve going at each other and beginning to blame each other and then finally coming to kind of resolution of conflict. Conflict resolution, sociologically speaking, is very fascinating throughout this text. Finally, of course, there's another way politically to think about this text. The new worlds can be representative, for example, Eden and, of course, Pandemonium, where the devils live, can be representative of two different types of new worlds. Milton was very interested in the idea of new worlds. We just mentioned a few minutes ago of Newton and Principia Mathematica and the idea of understanding the world. Galileo was the only contemporary, along with Columbus, mentioned in this poem, referenced in the opening books, and then of course in book 5 outright mentioned, right? What about the idea of politics and parliament and the way that Milton, as we said in earlier lectures like on Areopagitica, Milton was very much in tune and a part of the politics and the political climate of his day. This is an interesting critique of politics and the ways in which we try to create some notion of stasis, harmony, unity, and it all seems often to fall apart. Why is it the case that we cannot put a bunch of people together? A team comes to mind, a group of people comes to mind, a nation comes to mind, and they find some way to be friends and get along. Why is it that it's so hard to do that? And the moment that we feel like we finally have some kind of national unity or group unity, team unity, things start to fissure and break apart. Why is that? Are we suggesting that paradise inevitably fractures when you put a bunch of people together? Of course, Milton's views of the church and religion in general, and of course for anybody on the outside of Christianity looking in, is there one Christian church? Well, there is until there's more than one. Of course, the Protestants are going to begin to raise that question. And then, of course, well, is there one Protestant church? And then, of course, it splays into many other differences as well. Final observations. In my estimation, and I've tried really hard in my lectures to try to present information to you from multiple sides. I don't have a single agenda that I'm trying to convince you of. I hope that that's been the case in my delivery. But I will say this. If you are going to really appreciate British literature, and therefore, by extension, Western thought, I think through British literature, I think it's important that you have 3 texts and authors in mind. The first is Chaucer, the second is Shakespeare, and now the third is for you, Milton. I believe that if you understand those 3 authors, Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales, Shakespeare especially in his tragedies, and I believe especially Hamlet, because Hamlet is such an influential text for Milton, I believe. I tried to make that argument. And now finally, Paradise Lost. Although, a caveat, and I'll say it in a moment again, I think when we talk Paradise Lost, we have to talk Paradise Regained as well, because for me, it's just as an amazing, it's an amazing poem in its own particular ways. I think that Milton does what all great thinkers do. He takes the stuff that came before, especially in Chaucer and Shakespeare, and he brings them together along with that prodigious study of his. And I love to say this about Milton. He is an example of a guy who takes all of his learning and tries to somehow formulate something new out of it, which is, of course, what all great genius always does. We've already said it. No more epics after Milton. You might constitute the 1922 T.S. Eliot Wasteland as an epic of a kind. Some have called it the postmodern epic. T.S. Eliot publishes Wasteland in 22 without a lot of footnotes and notes and the like. And in that regards, very much like the polymath of Milton. He's got all this knowledge that he just wants to kind of present. In terms of the question of what is the American epic, and of course I've asked this in other lectures about American thought, what is our epic? Emerson, of course, calling for the great epic. We need an epic that's not of Europe or not of England. And Whitman, many have said, step up, the 1855 to 1892 deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. But that's a different kind of understanding of epic if Song of Myself, for example, is going to be understood as the great American epic. Well, that's it. The poem is yours. 10,565 lines of poetry that I argued from the beginning I think is some of the most remarkable poetry. But can I say this out loud? This is a poem that you have to read over and over again. I think I even gestured to the fact that my children, when I took them to the park, I read lines from Paradise Lost to them many, many years ago. It's true. But can I say this out loud? You're going to read this poem differently throughout your life. You read it as a student one way. You will find that as a parent, you will read it again, but much differently as a parent. And I can say this as well to you, being a grandparent, you will read it as a grandparent even more. That idea of legacy as you begin to kind of watch the child you raise become a parent and how amazing that process is. Well, there it is, Paradise Lost. But wait, I feel like I'm selling Gingy knives or something. There's more, believe it or not. Milton, there was a statement made to him, at least this is the story, that a pal of his said something about, okay, you tell us how paradise was lost, but can you tell us how paradise was found? And that led Milton, or some version of that story, led Milton to decide to sit down and retell the story that is referenced in the New Testament, the Christian New Testament, from Matthew 4, Luke 4, of what is often referred to as the temptations of Christ. And Milton sits down to write Paradise not lost, but now Paradise Regained in 1671. I hope that you will stay with me. That's our next course of study in the Harvard Classics Volume 4, and I look forward to those studies. Thank you guys for sticking with me through these lectures. You're amazing. I appreciate it.